I'm Victoria from Biblio Lifestyle, and you're listening to the Reader's Couch podcast, the show that will help you bridge the gap between living a full and busy life to one where you're reading, learning new things, and having fun. Today on the couch, I'm so excited to welcome author Tracy O'Neill to talk about her memoir, Woman of Interest. Woman of Interest is a self-reflective memoir about a Korean-born adoptee and her journey to meet her biological mother. Tracy was adopted and raised in New England and is now a writer and professor. And we see her delve into her past to uncover the identity of the woman who gave her up. From filing a missing persons report and working with a private investigator, she embarks on a journey that eventually leads her to Korea. Now, even though Woman of Interest is a memoir, it also reads like a mystery novel, but we also get those very personal and vulnerable and emotional moments too. But before we get into the episode, please take a few seconds to subscribe, rate, and review this show. It really helps the podcast. And if you have something you'd like to share, click the Send Me a Text link in the show's description and let me know what you think about this episode. If you've read Woman of Interest or you're adding it to your TBR, or you can tell me about the last book you read and that you loved. Alrighty, listeners, thanks in advance. And now onto the episode with author Tracy O'Neill. Hi friends, welcome again to the Reader's Couch. I'm your host, Victoria Wood, and here on the couch with me to talk about her memoir, Woman of Interest, is author Tracy O'Neill. Hi Tracy, welcome to the Reader's Couch.
Hi, how's it going?
It's good. I'm super excited to have you here. How are you feeling? Your memoir is out. It's available in the world. Readers can get their hands on a copy. What has the experience been like so far?
Just fun and fancy-free.
I know it's not your first rodeo. You had 2 novels before, but this is your story. How different is it for you to be just sharing it?
It is very different. I will admit that I was terribly embarrassed about it for a little while. You're sharing a great deal about your life, and I think if you want the memoir to be any good, you do have to reveal things about yourself that might be a little bit embarrassing. So I did think a little bit about what people would think about it, say my boss at work or so on and so forth recently, but I've mostly gotten over that at this point.
I'm glad to hear it because I want to shout this book from the rooftops and tell people to pick up a copy of Tracy's new book because I think it's an incredibly insightful, eye-opening, but also self-reflective and vulnerable memoir. And I appreciate that when an author can just really open up. And I felt like you cracked yourself open to, one, go on the journey you did, which you detail in the book, but also to put it out there in the world. So before I really share my thoughts and ask questions about it, I want to give you an opportunity to share with listeners about your new book, about your memoir, Woman of Interest, and what can readers expect when they pick up a copy?
Sure. So the book begins in 2020. That's around the time that I began to search madly for the mother who didn't raise me, a woman who I understood at the time to be named Jo Ki-yeon. And so it covers that search for her, my missing woman, but also for someone else who I thought was a missing woman, namely the person who I could be at a time when I was feeling a little bit lost myself.
I have to ask, because you mentioned 2020, would you say you were feeling lost before, or was it more of the pandemic really pushed you to go on this journey?
I think that sometimes events occur that take, let's say, a somewhat latent feeling and then bring it to the surface. So I'm sure that to some extent I was feeling a little bit lost, but certainly the pandemic sharpened that. I think that many people found the pandemic to be a time in their lives where they had to really rethink the organization of it. And many of us were so isolated at that point. And so it forced us to think about not only who we are, but who we are in relationship to other people. And I think that this was something that I very much wanted to investigate in the book.
Absolutely. I know for myself and just friends and family and people I've just talked to in the years since, I think a lot of us really stopped for a moment because we're so busy just going every day, going about our everyday lives. But I think in that moment, even people we haven't thought about for years, we started to, in those moments, especially very early in the pandemic, to think about where they are. What are they doing? Are they okay? Because I found myself thinking about distant friends, family that I don't have a relationship with. And just, I found myself questioning. So I was really curious if that was something you're experiencing too as well. So it's really interesting to hear. But for our listeners, you go on this journey to find your biological mother. So it's noteworthy to mention that you're an adoptee. You were born in Korea and you were raised here in the States. So this is a search for your biological mom. You had a name to go off, but I liked how you really took us on the journey with this book. So it really starts with you filing a missing persons report. Tell us about that.
Yes, I didn't know what I was doing. So I was trying to figure out, well, what do you do when you have a missing person? Did you file a missing person report? What organizations can I go to look for this person? As you said, I'm adopted. So I tried to find things from the adoption agency that had organized my adoption, but it didn't exist anymore. It had closed down several years before. And even the website was no longer really functioning, although I did find it in the Wayback Machine. I don't know if you know what that is, but it archives things from the internet. I eventually ended up finding somebody from that adoption agency by looking at those internet archives and seeing like there was an event that had been hosted years and years before, and a name was mentioned. So I Googled that name, and then it seems like this person was a social worker there at the time that I had been adopted. When I dug deeper, and I ended up finding her. And of course, I tried to hire a private investigator to find my mother. And I spoke to many detectives, and a lot of them said basically, you don't have enough information. Some people said, we could try to look and it'll be X amount of dollars, no guarantees, but it didn't sound like they were very confident. And then I ended up spending a lot of time talking to one private investigator, Joe, and he didn't exactly take my case. He ended up being almost like my private investigation sensei, like training me to think about how to look for somebody, but not really taking the case on himself.
I actually found the bit with the private investigator, some bits of it are humorous, because I also want listeners to know that, yes, this is your memoir, this is your true story, but there are moments of levity in there as well. It also read like a mystery novel to me, because we're trying to find your mom, which again, it's very serious, but it was just so compelling, your story. I just kept turning the pages. And so I loved some of the conversations with the private investigator. We also see you traveling alone, mind you, to Korea for a few weeks. What made you decide to actually go? Did you feel like you had to go? Was it that the information you had found up to that point, you felt you needed to take that extra step? Tell me about the decision to go to Korea.
Yeah. One of the reasons that I really felt at this moment that I needed to go was that, of course, we were going through a pandemic, and I am not exactly a spring chicken. I'm not saying I'm old. I'm not a child. And my mother, I knew to be in her 70s at this point. And so I was quite worried about, if I don't go now, then is something going to happen to her, right? Like she could die. It could be COVID, or it could just be something else. I didn't know anything really about the way that she was living her life or what her health was like. And I had not looked for a really long time. When it became clear that she was alive, and also happened to be right as Omicron was spiking, I felt as though if I had to go at that moment, because I didn't know if I would have another chance.
Of course, that makes absolute sense. And readers will get more insight into your thoughts and your feelings as they read along as well We also get to see, and I would say maybe this is like the second half of the book, if I had to divide it in two, that you do meet your mom. So it's fair to say meeting occurs. What happens during that meeting, I'll leave readers to discover themselves. But I also want to talk about the after meeting your mother bit. Even after your search, which you started, and you traveling to Korea, and then you eventually meeting her, there is the after portion of it. And ik felt, and this is just me now, this is not from the book, this is just me imposing my thoughts and my feeling, is that even after it wasn't over mentally for you. Would that be the case? Would you say you were still searching? Because at the top of our chat, you said that, you were feeling lost, and I was asking about the pandemic aiding that. And then now you've met her. It's like the end of the mystery, but the novel, in the case of a mystery novel, it's not really over just when you might have found out who the person is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that you really nailed it. The book, in so many ways, is about questioning, and the way in which I think many of us move through life always questioning to some extent. And there might be these moments where we feel like something in particular can solve some of the questions that we have about ourselves or about how to live. But ultimately, we don't suddenly get an answer, and then everything after that is just clear, and we just break on through for the next 40 years without any doubts. Yeah, I think that's very much the case.
Yes. So I'm really curious about, again, your decision to commit this story to paper, because, again, going back to what you were saying in the beginning, you felt like you had to go on this journey. You were feeling a bit lost. Of course, the pandemic kind of edged things and pushed you on this journey maybe a bit more. But you did this for you. And now you've committed your story to paper. And again, we can all read it. Hopefully my listeners will pick up a copy and read it too. What made you decide to share your journey with the world and just your experiences, that of just identity and belonging and the complexities of adoption, which I can't even imagine, and also family and the meaning of family?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of questions there in a way. Certainly, I wrote 2 books before this one, and it's, I think, difficult to overstate how much writing has organized my life. It's pretty encompassing for me, and the way that I process the world around me, the way that I think about how I spend my time, the way that I move through the world looking at it. I think that this was such an enormous experience in my life. I almost didn't even know how to function without writing about it. I'm not great at functioning without writing, period. But so there was that in terms of just the writing and trying to make sense of these things that happened that in many ways felt to me to be so paradoxical and confusing, but also enlivening and interesting. And so I needed to do that. But in terms of sharing, so that moment where the text leaves you and goes out into the world, I'm not even sure that I can provide a great answer for that. I think in some ways there were moments that I felt a lot of doubt about not only what it meant having met my mother, but also whether it really was meaningful in some capacity. And I think that the moment at which the work ceases to belong to you and becomes something that other people can be in dialogue with, other people can think about and interpret and think about in relationship to their own lives, a different meaning is attained. And I think that there was something maybe a little bit optimistic and hopeful in me that maybe this experience does take on a different sense of meaningfulness in that process. But I certainly understand that is maybe egomaniacal.
No, not at all. And for me, it really opened my eyes to a completely different experience. So no, I actually don't think of your view as being distorted in expectation and hope of putting the story out there. Actually, I think one, it's brave because I don't know if I could have done it or if I were in your shoes. And that's just me being honest. But also, I know it will be eye opening to people like me who don't have that experience, don't know someone personally in our everyday life who is an adoptee. So, yeah, it was just, I appreciated you sharing your story. And it had me curious too, as well. Have you connected with folks in the adoptive community, whether adoptee parents, which I know your parents adopted you, but just other parents or other adoptees themselves?
I think just in the course of life I have. So I haven't really gotten involved in any organizations or anything like that, but in just moving through the world, it certainly comes up. I remember one of the first friends that I made in college was adopted, like this guy that I worked with at one of my first jobs in New York City was. I've had students that are. It just comes up along the way, and I have conversations with people. I'm not sure if I actually know all that many adoptive parents, but certainly it's interesting because people have such different orientations. I think especially people who have been adopted, there are some people who feel very strongly that about biological mothers' rights. There are some people that I've noticed feel that adoption is this greater good. And I always find the conversations to be really interesting when I do have them. And actually, I'm going to take that back because I will also say that I did a piece of journalism a few years back, and it was about single men trying to adopt children and the challenges that they face, specifically because there is an often unspoken fear about why are these single men adopting children? Is there something untoward here?
And I think especially in America, as it relates to the conversation about reproductive rights, which is a big thing, especially right now, and it being under threat, is that the way adoption is talked about through mainstream media is very different. And I don't think we hear much from the adoptees themselves, but instead the focus is always on the adults, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I think that there's probably a growing discourse around it. I know that Nicole Chung has written about this, and she's been very vocal. And there are several other adoptees that have been as well. I think that there's a lot of like internet groups where people talk about it as well. So yeah, it is interesting hearing how divergent these takes are.
Yes.
And this book really, I want to be very clear that I'm not talking for anyone else. People have their own experiences, and this is mine. So yeah.
Yes, and I think that's what we actually need is more voices being added to the conversation so that in the case of people like me, we can listen and we can learn and we can just respect the position of each adoptee as they share their stories, because your story is not going to be the same as someone else who maybe decides to share their story and write about it in the future. So I think it's very important to the discourse that we do have a variety of voices. You also mentioned earlier about your fiction work. You have 2 books. I haven't read any, I have to admit, but I'm curious, are you planning to still write fiction? Are you working on anything right now? What can you tell us?
Yeah, I absolutely am planning on continuing to write fiction. I have a collection going right now, a short story collection, which is a little bit more funny and still, I think it's tragic funny in some ways, but it's organized by a constraint that I have given myself and very voice driven. And then there's another novel that I'm starting to do research for, which is my maybe big anti-capitalist novel. And so that one, I'm going to be doing something maybe a little bit closer to Quotients, which was my last novel, which is like a large cast of characters and looking at sort of some high stakes examples, right? So I'm going to be looking at like the world of DeFi, so on and so forth. So yeah, I do have these other things in mind, but really over the last couple of years, my mind has been so tuned to women of interest.
Of course, and that's understandable. But I'm excited to see you dip your toes back into fiction. I'm also curious about your reading life too, as well. So share with our listeners some of your favorite memoirs. So let's start with nonfiction.
Yeah, I love Easy Beauty by Chloe Cooper Jones. It's a memoir that's written in essays. It really looks at this question of how bodies move through the world and also how they move through the world in when we have a sense of aesthetics and how we calibrate to the aesthetics of the world around us and how we process them and what it means to be interested in beauty. I love that book. I love Heavy by Kiese Lemon. That was one of the first memoirs that really just knocked my socks off. He has a really incredible sense of rhythm and a willingness to engage with larger questions around race and self-worth. And I love that. I think everyone loves The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. I don't even know if it needs any introduction. And then another book that I'll mention is Aftershocks by Nadia Owusu, which is also a memoir and essays. It, in some ways, is a coming of age and narrative of family that spans the entire globe. And there are some sort of more fragmentary parts that formally represent this idea of the aftershock. So that's a book that's very close to my heart as well.
Awesome. I love your selections. I really loved Heavy as well. So I was glad to hear you love that too, as well as Aftershocks, The Year of Magical Living. I haven't read Easy Beauty though. So that's a book for my reading list.
Oh, yeah. Please do yourself a favor. You have to read it. It's great.
Okay, awesome. I'm excited. Tell me about your favorite childhood books, though.
So there is one in particular that I want to mention. So it's called Cully Cully and the Bear. And I don't think I've ever even met anybody else who's read this book, but it is, I think, almost like a Beckett play for children. It basically involves a guy and he is afraid of this bear, and the bear is also afraid of him, and they are basically running around in circles, and at a certain point it's unclear who's chasing who or who's running away from who because they're running in these circles. And it's like an amazing meditation on fear. And so I really love that book, or I loved it when I was a kid. And then the other thing, which I mentioned in Women of Interest, actually, is that when I was growing up, my father would tell me these stories that he made up, and they featured a character that he made up also, Elvira, who was basically just like a stand-in for me. But that was my introduction to storytelling and what got me telling stories, because my father was making these stories up, and at a certain point I asked him, like, so you can just make up stories? And he was like, yeah. So then I was like, then why don't I tell you stories, like bedtime stories? And I just want to mention that too.
Oh, I love hearing that, actually. That's really sweet. And yes, you can make up stories. And clearly you do that now. You write books. So I think that's really cool. What books are you looking forward to reading in the year ahead?
So I recently heard that the writer Andrea Long Chu has a book coming out called Authority. So that is something that I definitely want to read. Chu's written some really incredible literary criticism, taking on books by Otessa Moshfegh and Bret Easton Ellis and many people. I want to read that. There's also some books that it's like they're not coming out in the coming year, but that I have like on my desk, like in the hopper, ready to go. So I recently bought James by Percival Everett, and I'm really excited to dig into that. And The Parisian by Isabella Hamad, which I think has been recommended for years now to me, but I hadn't gotten a chance to read yet, or haven't gotten a chance to read yet.
I think lots of readers can relate to that one book that you've been recommended so many times, but you just haven't gotten around to yet. But I hope you'll get around to The Parisian soon.
Thank you. Yes, me too. Me too.
So on the show, we love our indie bookstores. So share with our listeners some of your favorite local indies.
Okay, yeah, the list goes on, but I'll just shout out a few that I really love. Terrace Books in Windsor Terrace used to be my local bookshop. I used to live a couple of blocks away, but they still have a special place in my heart. I go to the McNally Jackson in Williamsburg, Brooklyn quite a bit. And for a long time, I've gone to the Word Bookstore in Greenpoint. Also, I love Black Spring Books in Williamsburg for used books. They also do a lot of great events in their cute little backyard. And if I'm feeling like I want to explore, then I go to the Strand in Union Square in Manhattan. And yeah, those are some of my favorites. I also want to say Greenlight Bookstore is incredible. And I think really one of the first indie bookstores in Brooklyn that the people started really gathering around and feeling was a place to have events and get real life bookseller recommendations. I also love Greenlight.
Yay, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing these because we love indie bookstores here. So if there's anyone in New York, check them out. And if you're visiting, also pop in as well. Getting back to your book, Women of Interest, and just wrapping things up and tying it together. Again, I know it's your story. You've put it out there. You're sharing it with the world. What are you hoping in an ideal world readers might think or feel, or what discussions are you hoping readers might have after they've turned the last page?
Yeah, to some extent, I think as an author, you have to accept that the story is no longer yours alone once it goes out into the world. And part of the beauty of being an author is allowing people to take the book in whatever way that they do. But certainly, I hope that people can have a lot of conversations around the question how we become a self or many selves over our lives, and what it means to self-investigate, what it means to investigate those around us too. I hope that people think about what family is to them and what family can be, how it can include people that we choose in our lives that are not just our biological families, but also our friends or significant others or maybe animals. And yeah, I'm sure that there are other things that people will pick up on in the book that I'm not even thinking of myself right now. But really just, I think that I'm excited to see what people do take from the book and how they feel that there is something that's worth talking about in their own lives or worth thinking about in their own lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have to say, this was incredibly emotional. It was thought-provoking, and it really looks at the complexities of family, adoption, identity, and just how we can be our own selves and be authentically ourselves in this world. So it really gave me a lot to think about, but it was also page-turning as well. Readers, I hope you will pick up Women of Interest by Tracy O'Neill. Tracy, thank you so much for coming on the show and speaking with me. This has been fun.
It has been so fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Reader's Couch podcast. Please subscribe to the show, share it with a friend, and take a few seconds to leave a rating and review. Until next time, stay lounging, stay reading, and whenever you're in doubt, go straight to your local bookstore or library. Thanks again for listening, and happy reading.